Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today are the villagers from Wargames Atlantic. Now these guys would actually come along as part of the release for the Guards of Traitor's Toll, and in that game they have a mechanical use. Your villagers are actually wandering around the table waiting for your guards to do something for them, which is kind of cool. You don't see a lot of games doing that. As well, if you're playing D&D or anything which needs a bunch of villager types, you want to put some miniatures on the table, it's a brilliant kit. So we're going to take a brief look at the frame itself, and there'll be timestamps down the bottom if you want to jump around straight to the painting. All of the paints, as always, will be listed in the description below, so let's be quick about it and get started. So we'll start off with a quick look at the sprue itself. Now there are photos of these available on the Wargames Atlantic website, which is going to give you more information. You can zoom in and all that, but I figured it would be useful just to take a quick peek because man, oh man, there are so many options on here, it's ridiculous. I genuinely found it a little bit intimidating when I first popped it open because there's just so many things you can do. I think I've probably assembled 3 of the most normal looking miniatures that you could make out of this box. You get 3 each, male and female sort of bodies. The arms are all effectively interchangeable. How that's managed is that the shoulder joint is a little bit smaller than the joint on the arm for most of the male figures. So those guys are going to look like they're wearing like vests or something like that, where the arm is a little bit smaller, whereas for the women, it's going to fit pretty well. The range of accessories is, like I said, it's stupid. There is so much on here. Most of the accessories are designed in such a way that they just fit over the top of the miniatures themselves. So if you've ever assembled, what's a good example? The World War I Germans from Wargames Atlantic, how their gas masks just dangle on the miniatures, these work pretty similarly. You've got things like cowls and what have you that just pop straight over the top of the bodies, aprons, all sorts of things, and it being a Wargames Atlantic sprue, there is just a stupid number of heads. I think you could really have some fun just taking a box of these and building the craziest combinations you can. There's beggars, there's merchants, there's thieves and workers. You could make so much stuff. So rather than cripple myself entirely by trying to use everything on the frame, I did assemble a couple of my guys to look like the ones on the box and then made a third after quite some deliberation. A lot of fun, and I think if you are into converting your plastic kits, this is a no-brainer. The Baron's War range, the Peasants' Levy, their arms and heads are going to fit pretty well on these as well. So if you want an armed revolt of grubby peasants, these things are going to do you an absolute treat. So very cool box. Like I said, a little bit intimidating if you're like me and you like having clear build like this. But for somebody who wants a box of bits, man, this is just, it's the business. When it comes to painting them, here I've actually I had to experiment a little bit. What I would recommend, if you're doing this at home, would be to just grab a can of something like Brain Matter Beige, or even Wraithbone from Citadel, and a nice light off-white with a little bit of warmth is going to be perfect. But I'm out of both of those, so I had to get creative. What I've done is first to spray them with Skeleton Bone, and then from above I've lightly spritzed them with a little bit of white. Now the texture that you can see on the camera is more pronounced on screen than it is in reality, but I am going to need to be mindful of that when it comes to shading these things, I think. If this doesn't work, well, I know where I went wrong, but sometimes an experiment is worth the effort. Now for all 3 figures, I'm going to start with the skin, it being near the lowest layer, and I'm going to use Agate skin for this. Covers very well. You may find in some areas you do want to come back and give it a second coat if you're getting a little bit of that primer showing through, but from a nice light primer like this, it'll probably not be a big problem. Now I did ultimately give that 2 coats, and I've got a nice solid color. I'm still a little worried about the texture that's visible there, but we'll see how that pans out. Now I'm going to go quickly through each of the miniatures in turn, laying down their base coats, because the finishing touches are going to be pretty much identical. So starting off, first of all, I have here deep grey, and I'm going to paint in the washerwoman's skirt with this. Now that went on really smoothly with just one coat, so I'm quite happy with that. We're going to move on now to ash grey, and I'm going to paint in her blouse up to the edge of where her vest is going to be. Now for her vest, I'm going to use alpha blue. You might be tempted to go for something like ultramarine blue or similar, but what I'd suggest is that because of the way we're going to shade these, and then not really do a huge amount more to them, try using something that's a little bit lighter than you normally would. So carefully around here. Now leather brown is going to do a fair bit of work on all three of these miniatures, because here I'm going to use it to paint in her hair, and I'm also going to use it to paint in her little shoes and her belt. Now you could do the belt in a different color, maybe a darker brown, but we're looking to save time and get villagers on the table relatively quickly here. The basket that she's carrying, I'm going to paint in Paratrooper Tan. Now it's important, I reckon, that because we're going to be painting quite a few villagers, particularly if you've got the whole box, that some of these colors are going to perform double duty on quite a few miniatures. Now at this point, if you need to, what you could do would be to go back with a little bit of white, tidy up some of the cloth, but I'm going to leave her hat, her apron, and the washing that she's carrying in just that. So for our jeweler, having mentioned that we're going to use a couple of those colors a few times, let's go back to that deep gray. I'll paint in his trousers, and I'm also going to use this to fix up his beard. And so too, with leather brown, we're going to paint in his tunic. Now you could paint this in, two separate colors. I'm going to do it in one. I like the idea that he's wearing just a big, quickly thrown over the top. Now just because of the way this miniature is assembled, I know folks are going to ask, well, how do I reach under his apron? And here's the neat part. You don't. Anything that you cannot see, don't bother painting it. Don't fuss with reaching something that you're not going to see ever again. What we're going to move on to now, speaking of the apron though, is some Bootstrap brown, because I want a dark, well-worn, leathery sort of color here. This is not terribly complex. If you wanted even more contrast here between the two browns, what I'd recommend would be to go all the way down to Brigadine brown, but I think this is going to work pretty well once we're finished. Now I'm going to use here Dryad brown. If you wanted a little bit darker, you could go to Tree Ancient, but the ruddy brown line is a nice brown range, funnily enough, but it's got a little bit of reddish warmth to it. So it's brilliant if you want to add a little bit of variety to your leather colors and what have you. So what I'm going to do is paint in his boots. There's a little satchel here, and I will paint in the strap on his goggles with this, just to introduce a bit of warmth to what is currently quite a flat miniature. Now I was going to do the lenses in his little goggles grey, but it occurs to me I've got alpha blue right here, so let's just dot those in. And we'll go to Paratrooper Tan again, and we're going to paint in the wood on his hammer. This might be a little bit tricky from some angles, but take your time, and don't worry if you do make a little mistake, because we're still at the stage where it's very easy to tidy up. Then for the head of his hammer, and indeed pretty much any of the metal on most of these miniatures, I'm going to use gunmetal. There is an exception to this though. You could use gunmetal for his goggles, but just very quickly off screen, I'm going to use true brass for them instead. It's a fair bit brighter. It's got a little bit of yellowy warmth, but I'm just going to do it because I think it's going to look nicer. Now I might need to tidy up a little of the top of his head there, but for his gem, what I have is pure red. Now, you could as easily paint this as a wee bit of coal or what have you, but I think on the box it looks like he's handling, something precious here. So I'm going to paint it bright red because that's nice and easy. And hang on to that red because we're going to use it again on this fella here. Now I have already painted in his satchel and his axe using the Paratrooper Tan from earlier, but the red we're just going to go ahead and pop over his neckerchief here. This will cover very well over this nice light primer. Now again, sticking to colors we've already used, you could go ahead, bust out the leather brown here, but I'm going to use ash grey on this fella's trousers. And then, why not? Let's put some leather brown over his shoes. Now, why I've gone straight over the top of all of those ties on his trousers there. So you see, they aren't really leg wraps. They are little threads and what have you, holding his trousers down. I've gone straight over the top of that because when we dry brush this fella, I reckon we'll be able to get the definition we need there without having to painstakingly paint in those individual straps. We'll use that Dryad brown from earlier to polish off his belt. Oops, I will need to tidy up that ash grey there, not to worry. Now, like the others, I'm going to leave parts of his shirt. I'm going to leave his shirt white, actually. And this is why I would normally suggest doing a single stage primer. But hopefully this works. What I'm going to do for his hair, this is Wasteland Clay. This is one of the ochre range. Quite commonly, I'll see folks getting out a yellow paint here. And I'm like, no, blonde isn't yellow. But this, once we shade it, is going to become a little bit more dull in the recesses. Remembering that we have got a dry brush to come over the top of this yet. Now what we're going to turn to is a large dry brush, a little bit of kitchen towel here to work out most of that stuff, and some ancient stone. So I've got very, very little in my brush by the time I'm done. So starting across his hair, for example, this is the easiest place to see what you're going to leave behind without changing up the texture too much. And I might even have taken off a little too much from my brush, but that's not a problem. We'll just build up the color by passing over it a couple of times. And we want to go over pretty much everything, really except the white. So don't worry too much if you do hit it, because the ancient stone's barely going to show up on it. But everything else, just a light flick against the detail so that you catch those raised areas, and we get a little bit more subtle definition. Now, some folks are going to point out that you do get a slightly chalky appearance from a dry brush, and in some cases that's going to be true, but because of what we're going to do, the next couple of steps, it is not going to matter too much. If you need to, you can top off your brush again. So away we go, dry brushing, first of all, this fella. Then we'll do the same on the Smith, concentrating predominantly across and down these areas of detail, just to pick those out. A little bit of that slightly chalky appearance on some areas is going to help sell the natural texture of the fabric. So don't worry if you do catch some flat areas with a little bit of this ancient stone. So I'm going to do this all over this fella too, and on our washerwoman. Now, anywhere that you are worried you might have applied too much, what you can do is go back to your base color and just tidy it out. But I would suggest to you keep the faith and maybe add a little bit more than you would probably think is going to look good, because the wash is going to help this a bit. What I've got here, this is strong skin shade, and I've thinned it out in my little palette. I've mixed in 2 parts of the shade with 1 part of speed paint medium. So for every 2 drops of wash, 1 drop of the medium. Reason being, I want this to flow slightly more smoothly than it would if I was going to use it neat from the bottle. I don't want it to stain quite as darkly. But I do still want plenty of warmth, plenty of shading. I'm using this instead of strong tone. Like I said, that warmth is going to be important. And I'm going to go over the entire miniature with this. Anywhere that you get big clumps of it settling, what you can do while it's wet is just wick some of that away with your brush. And particularly on the white areas, I want to just move it away and let it settle just in the creases. Now, I still haven't seen the finished product. You've seen it going around on the turntable at the start of the video, but I don't know yet whether or not that white is going to turn out the way I want. So fingers crossed at this point, but you got to experiment sometimes. Once I've got this fella all shaded, what I'm going to do is pop him in the sun and leave him then for about half an hour. Let's see, fingers crossed, what we get. So, with that dried, yeah, we're not into total disaster territory. It is a little darker than I would have liked, and I think in hindsight, maybe mixing out the wash with half and half speed paint medium might have been better, but I'm not unhappy with that finish. But I want to show you one thing we can do to tidy up that white a little bit. So on my palette over here, I'm going to pop on a little dot of ancient stone. Then off to the side, I'm going to put down a couple of dots of war paint stabilizer. Now, it doesn't need to be the stabilizer. You can use water here for this instead, but you'll get a slightly smoother finish by using these two together. Now what I'm going to do is to grab my brush, dip it into the stabilizer until I've got a wee bit on there, and then instead of just blorping it straight into the top of the paint, I'm going to go in near the edge, just start working out a little of the paint at a time until I get quite a thin consistency. And I don't want this to be quite as thin as a glaze, but I don't want it to cover properly in the same way as I would if it were just straight from the pot. So using here Nature's Incredible Palette, I'll just run a little bit of that across my thumb. Yeah, that's about the consistency I want. Now what I'll do is run just a little bit of that onto the higher points of the white that I want to be slightly tidier. So you don't need to do a huge amount of this, because wherever you do it, it is going to change up the texture a fair bit, and we want to avoid having to highlight this if we can, to make these look a little bit nicer. I think this is a good touch. So same as with everything, you can do as much or as little of this as you like. If you find it's covering a little bit more solidly than you would like, just thin it out with a bit more of that medium. Start about midway up the apron, and just lay it down similarly to how we would if we were highlighting traditionally. But because we've got so much of that stabilizer in there, and we've got a nice thin finish, it's going to dry and still let us see a little bit of that texture through our paint layer. So for the flatter areas, I'm going to use this, but for the creases, I will use a slightly less thinned out mix. And there we go, with a little bit of that tidy up. Yeah, why not? You could go ahead and also highlight the skin. Maybe grab Barbarian Flesh and highlight them in a manner similar to how I did the actual guards themselves. But I'd suggest we're looking at diminishing returns on guys that we want to paint fairly quickly. So what I'm going to do is go ahead, take these guys outside, hit them with a spray varnish, and I'm going to use the Army Painter's Varnish for that today. As well, we're going to go ahead and base them, and the recipe for that will be in the description. So let's get a look at our little mob here once they are all finished. And so there we go, our villages are complete. Maybe not as brightly coloured as the guards as I've done before, but I kind of like that slightly more muted, I'm not going to say realistic, but it is that brown medieval filter, that we put on that sort of style. I quite like how that's turned out. Couple of lessons that I've definitely learned is that I should have stuck to my guns and just used the Brain Matter Beige primer, like ordered some and waited for it to show up. But the end result isn't too different to what I would have gotten anyway. So I'm not unhappy, but yeah, sometimes patience would be a virtue. So again, thanks go to Wargames Atlantic for letting me have a box of these guys. They're a lot of fun to play with, and I have so many villages I don't know what to do with them now. But as well, thanks go to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my wonderful producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much for your support, folks. I mean it every time. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked down there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.